everyone. I have the pleasure of introducing award-winning poet, novelist, translator, and scholar, Sinan Antoon. Antoon's body of work is extensive and includes 5 novels, 2 collection of poems, and multiple literary translations, including of Ibtisi Madim's The Book of Disappearance and Mahmoud Darwish's In the Presence of Absence. His work has been translated into 17 languages. His poems and essays have appeared in The Nation, Plowshares, The Guardian, and The New York Times, just to name a few. He's an associate professor at NYU and is the co-founder and co-editor of Dadalia. Antoon was born and raised in Baghdad. In 1991, when the United States invaded Iraq, Antoon and his family fled their homeland. Antoon returned to Baghdad in 2003 to film a documentary. This time, the United States had occupied the entire country. In most of Antoon's work, Iraq is a central character. His pieces confront America's imperial violence in the country and explore the human and ecological cost of war. But amidst the debris of destruction, he also manages to find joy, beauty, and humor. In 2016, Antoon's groundbreaking novel, Collateral Damage, was longlisted for the Arabic Booker. When asked in an interview about the role beauty plays in the book, he said, "There's plenty of pain and destruction, but there is beauty too among the ruins. And this beauty is at times a solace, as well as a defense against destruction and brutality." In August, Antoon published his latest book of poems, Postcards from the Underworld. The book touches on the haunting aftermath of war. In an interview about his craft choices, he elaborated on his use of sequence poems, saying, "In the era of permanent wars, those of us who cannot or choose not to look away confront a flood of images, faces, and figures, most of which disappear into the black holes of history. Those that do not are repackaged and rebranded by triumphalist narratives. The sequence poem is a space that allows the poetic eye to stand before the ruins of time and history and to try to salvage the shards." Of Antoon's many, many accolades, perhaps the most notable for our conversation tonight is his National Translation Award for his translation of Darwish's last prose book, In the Presence of Absence. In Antoon's introduction, he describes Darwish's book as a genius, genre-bending self-elegy, which charts Darwish's past and grounds his life in history and mythology. But this book is not merely a reflection of a singular I. Rather, Darwish is speaking to and from a collective identity, an identity that encompasses his fellow exiled people. Darwish was born in Palestine in 1941 and then displaced to Lebanon with his family during the Nakba. Darwish later returned to his homeland, but this land was no longer his. It was now called Israel. When Antoon returned to Baghdad in 2003, after 12 years of exile, he had no one to return to. The city, which was once his home for 24 years and brimming with loved ones, was now void of any relatives or close friends. Antoon had no one to stay with, so he checked into a hotel. He was a visitor in his own home. Dispossession is a pain both Darwish and Antoon share. Through their poems, they explore the liminal space between exile and home, life and destruction, in hopes that they can conjure a better future. Perhaps that's why Antoon often refers to poems as prayer. Please join me in welcoming Sinan Antoon.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. So this is going to be a conversation between colleagues, also friends and colleagues. We've known each other for years. I was trying to remember when we first, in fact, met. I can't remember if it was before or after I started reading you, but we've known each other for at least 12 or 15 years, something like that.
There was some conference on translation in Charlie Turi and others.
Oh, right, at Queen's College.
Yes.
That's right. That's right. When I was teaching at Queen's College, you came and we invited you.
Yes.
Oh, yes, exactly. Okay. That mystery's been solved. Anyway, I thought that as anyone who's come to my office knows, the first thing I ask is, tell me about your translation life. And I would like to ask you to start with some storytelling You're speaking to an audience of grad students who are all writers, and most of them, the ones I know, are translators as well as writers, but everyone here is at least a writer of their own work. And there's some self-translators, there are some, so everybody has this plural. And would you tell us about your journey to writing and translation?
Sure. First, thank you so much, Julian, for the wonderful, very generous introduction. Really moving, and thank you, Susan, for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. I know there are a lot of events and activities. This is the thing I like in the States about they always thank you for choosing Wendy's, thank you for choosing United. Even though there is the myth of choice, thank you for choosing this event. As was said in the introduction, I grew up in Iraq, and there was an early fascination with language and with letters. And Iraq, like many countries in the global south, but especially in I would say the Middle East, even though that's a problematic term, but poetry, is a very impactful space culturally, and poets are held in high regard, and poetry is very consequential socially and politically. And in a way, I always say, in Brazil, everyone grows up thinking they're going to be a soccer player, and then they give up. In Iraq, for historical reasons, everyone also grows up thinking they're going to be a poet, because Baghdad was the center of the Arabo-Islamic Empire and the so-called Golden Age. That's another problematic term, but there is a long history of poetry writing, which extends to the modern period also. Iraq also happens to be the place where the so-called modern Arabic poetry was born. In the 50s, 2 men and 1 woman rebelled against the traditional structure and form of the Arabic ode, which had survived for 13 centuries, and started writing poetry. Of course, influenced by translations, mostly from English and American poetry. So, growing up in Baghdad, there's this mystique and aura that's tied to poetry. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I had the fortune or the misfortune of growing up at a time when I was a teenager. Saddam Hussein becomes the president of Iraq, but also due to the wealth coming from oil, the Iraqi state invests a lot of money in cultural production and in projecting a cultural image with dictatorship. And this is also when I get to read about, poets who are in exile because they wrote poems against dictatorship and so on and so forth. So early on, I got to realize that also writing was not this innocent activity, that poems and novels matter also. And early on also, when I was 12, there was the war with Iraq and Iran. So I guess I'm trying to give you the background to, first of all, I started to write, silly poems when I was a teenager, but then increasingly I realized that this writing business is something that people go to jail for, and so on and so forth. And it also coincided with when Iraq was having a war with Iran from 1980 until 1988. And by the way, at that time, the so-called free world was in support of Saddam's dictatorship. France and the United States, they were all supporting the supposedly secular regime of Saddam Hussein against fundamentalist Iran. Sorry, there's a lot of politics here, but it's inescapable. But also the flocks of writers and poets from the Arab world and from Europe would come to Baghdad and participate in all of these literary events and praise this cultural efflorescence. And at the time I was, a young boy who had just started reading, and I, knew that there was something wrong. So poetry written by poets in exile, dissident poets, also helped me intellectually and gave me kind of political compass. Those were the beginnings. So I started writing, but I couldn't publish because at the time, this is in the pre-digital age, before social media, before satellite channels, there was only newspapers and journals, and they were all controlled by this totalitarian regime. And to publish poetry, one had to either blatantly praise the dictator or write something that was, triumphalist. And I, thankfully, if I may say so, looking back, as much as naturally anyone who writes wants to share their writing with people, and there was a burning desire for me to be published, but I kind of thought that I didn't want to participate in this. So, of course, there was a group of us now in college, men and women who were writing, but who also shared this political opposition. And we had our own circle. And so the first time I published was I sent something to be published in a journal that was published in Paris. So I started out, to be honest with you, also having this sense of bitterness of not being part of any literary circles, not being part of the so-called generations. But it served me well because now, looking back, I can say that, I was never part of that. But to go back to the festivals, living in the 80s under a dictatorship, in an Orwellian regime, yet seeing all of these famous writers and poets, some of them also European poets and writers, coming to Iraq and praising the regime was very disconcerting for so many of us. So my initial desire was that I wanted to write a novel about what it means to live under dictatorship. And that's the first novel that I wrote, was called I'Jam, Iraqi Rhapsody. That's how I came to writing. So unfortunately, I'm often asked about this, even in the Arab world, ironically, about why all this writing about war and about death and about destruction. And I flippantly say, I would love to live in a world where I would only write about butterflies and roses, but this is the reality, visceral reality that I grew up in. And because for such a long time there was censorship and cultural production was controlled by the regime, there's this period of 15 years in Iraq's history that was not written about in a way that engages with the visceral realities. And this reminds me of Brecht, something like, what was the poem? Will there be poems in times of darkness? And he says, yes, there will be poems in times of darkness. And the last thing I would say is that, there are these Wordsworth saying poetry is the crystallization of human knowledge, and there are other, and I now retroactively realize that actually poetry is even more important than I thought it was, and that it does really transmit, of course, transmits beauty and has the affect and the effect, but it's also intellectually and epistemologically very important, and can be a form of resignification for an entire world. Sorry, as academics, we're trained to go on and on and on forever.
Yeah,
So very long answer, I'm sorry.
So the poets that you mentioned as giving you first inspiration outside Iraq, do you remember who?
Yeah, I remember Mahmoud Darwish and others were very important because at the time, of course, we grew up in a place and a time when it was normal to be pro-Palestinian, because that's where we're living, and we also lived. One of my childhood friends was someone whose family was kicked out of Palestine. So these are material realities for us. There was a poet called Muzaffar al-Nawab that I translated some of his poems into English, who was, he grew up in an aristocratic family, but he was a communist, and early on he refused to be co-opted by the regime and was imprisoned for a long time, and then he was sent to exile. And in the 1980s, he used to record his poems on cassette tapes, and these cassettes were smuggled to us into Iraq, because he was also not only writing against Saddam's regime, he was also writing against all of the Arab regimes. So his poetry was banned throughout the Arab world. But through the cassettes, his poems came to us, and these were, it was reassuring and reinforcing that. And there was another exiled poet by the name of Al-Jawahiri, who was also close to the Communist Party, who left Iraq in 1979 to Prague and then to Damascus. I mean, there's a reality is that, the Iraqi Communist Party from the 40s till the 80s was the most potent and most popular movement in Iraqi society, and a lot of the writers and poets happened to be communists. Of course, then later many of them sold out, but not all of them.
And when you say that these works came to us, to you, and you said you weren't part of a movement, so in what way were they disseminated?
Well, they were smuggled, actually. Someone would say, that's the...
So there were people that you were in touch
that's the
with
problem with remembering cases that are dictatorships. Of course, it's really tough, but also people are resourceful and they always find ways. I should say, though, because we're talking about translation, that part of the regime's project of cultural efflorescence was massive investment in translation. And there were a lot of novels from South America that were translated to Arabic, and a lot of them spoke of living under dictatorship. So these were very important for us because we kind of vicariously read them to kind of understand, or that's how some of us read them, that dictatorship is this condition that exists elsewhere in the world, and it's not necessarily, organically to the Arab or Muslim world. But and I guess this brings us to the way that, irrespective of the regime's intentions, these novels were read in different ways. And I should say that despite the censorship, there were acts of dissidents that were very creative. So I remember, for example, in the late 80s attending a Macbeth in a small experimental theater in Baghdad. And before going in, the director gave us these index cards that said, this play wants to destabilize the authority of the director and the authority of the one who thinks he controls everything. Mm-hmm. And for us, it was obvious that this was a statement about dictatorship. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes, I don't know, people say these are also safety valves, but also the censors, as we know, are not very smart or not creative readers, so things can be smuggled through despite everything.
At what point did you start reading poetry in more than one language? As we were saying before going in, I was fortunate enough to go to, although all the schools were nationalized, but a kind of an elite school for smart students and the sons of officials, which had a different English curriculum. So early on in the, when I was in about 16, I started to try to read in English. And then in college, I studied English literature, and translation was part of the curriculum when I started to translate. But I should add that on my father's side, I come from the Christian Chaldean minority in Iraq, and the older generation, my father's generation, amongst themselves, they spoke a dialect of Aramaic. And when we were kids, my father and the relatives would switch into this other language, and I was so frustrated for not understanding what they were saying. So I got this little notebook and started to ask them about all the meanings of the words to figure out what they were saying. And then it was very disappointing because it turned out they weren't saying anything very taboo. They were just talking about someone having marital problems. But I'm saying early on there was this type of translation, and also in Iraq, as in other places, there were many, many dialects, and the Christians, because they come from northern Iraq mostly, have a different dialect from the dialect in Baghdad.
So already I grew up speaking two dialects at home. One dialect at home and a different dialect on the street. So switching between registers was something normal for me. And yeah, so it gets to the whole issue of how much translation is a part of our daily lives, whether we realize it or not, depending on where we are.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So what do you translate? You have plenty of work to do. You have plenty of your own work to write.
Yes.
Why bother?
Why bother? Well, I think it started out also when wanting to share something so powerful and moving and beautiful and sharing with others. This is self-aggrandizing, but it's an act of generosity. But especially when coming into this country, or for example, how the Darwish book started, or I'd always translated, but I was so moved by the writing, and at the time I wanted to share it with someone who didn't know Arabic, and I wanted to share it with her. So that's how it started. And but I think it's also, now that I highlighted the generous aspect, it's also very narcissistic, because early on I realized that translation is a sort of rehearsal for writing itself, because I think the same dynamics are involved in trying to find the most suitable word. And another poet that I really admire, Sargon Bolus, who's an Iraqi American, and I've translated him. I learned from him early on that this, which he learned from Merwin, I think. Merwin in an interview was saying that if you can't write, then translate. So it's about just always being engaged with language, and you know this more than I do, that translation also allows you to really engage with the depths of a text in a way that even a writer doesn't, I think. Because I've noticed that when I translate someone's text, someone else's text, in the questions and the queries, I bring up things that they weren't aware of. Also, when just recently someone was translating my novel into Persian, and he asked me a lot of things, I was like, wow, I had not noticed that. So it's a kind of a different mode and a deeper relationship with the text, which is quite enjoyable and pleasurable. It's very tough, but it's very rewarding, I think.
And you obviously can write, do write in English now, the language in which your academic career takes place. However, tell us.
So, when I first came to this country in 1991, of course I was, had this desire to tell our story and to do it in English, but for a variety of reasons I didn't. Things were delayed, and I didn't end up writing a tell-all book about someone who just came from a God-forsaken dictatorship, and thank God I didn't. But increasingly I realized that, sadly and unfortunately, literature written in Arabic or other non-European languages does not arrive and is not received, particularly in this country, primarily as literature. It's oftentimes packaged and read and misread in very problematic ways, which I call forensic interest. It's not that literature doesn't have information and doesn't transmit information, and there is an anthropological aspect to it, there is an ethnographic aspect, there is history, but oftentimes literature written coming from the global south, especially from the Arab world, especially after 9/11, is just read as some kind of ethnography or sociology, even the way it's actually classified and put. And with my first novel that was translated into English, I was horrified by the way it was read. And so, when there is a French or a German novel reviewed in the Times or elsewhere, it's given either to a novelist who can appreciate that novel, or a scholar of German or French literature, or a translator who knows the field. This Ijam, Iraqi Rhapsody, was reviewed in the San Francisco Chronicle by someone who had written a travel book on Afghanistan. And of course, they went and read about my position regarding the invasion of Iraq, so half of the review. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't, and maybe I just got tired of doing that, and having always to translate in addition to the translation. And increasingly, not that I want to be read in all languages, but also in the dealings with the various editors and publishers. And I have immense respect for the translators who translate from all languages, but it's such a tough fight to convince the editors and the publishers why a novel should be more. For example, they think that if you publish one novelist from Syria, then that's it, that's enough. There's one is enough to represent them all. So it's the old story of Orientalism, of Eurocentric approaches. And also I must say that I like Arabic. And like to write in it and translate myself rather than just. So I was trying also to, as much as possible, resist the temptations. There is also, of course, what types of themes are translator friendly. So, real example, you were saying about the Book of Collateral Damage, my novel.
Most recent one.
So when I was thinking of it, and when I had an agent, I met the agent somewhere around here, and I was telling her, I have this novel, and I thought at the time it has a very interesting structure and idea, a bookseller in Baghdad who has this manuscript that he wants to write the history of the war, but never gets beyond the first minute. And her response was like, that's way too complicated and way too postmodern. I need an arc, I need a journey. And that was so the moment, and I'm like, so this is not meant against anyone. And I was asked by a friend once the same question, who's an Iraqi filmmaker who had just come to this country. He's like, how many novels do you sell? 6, 8, 9, 10,000 in Arabic? Why don't you write in English? I kind of tried to tell him that in English there are almost certain taxes and certain compromises that you have to make, more so than as a filmmaker, that I'm not willing to make anymore. I'm too old.
You can't be too old. If you're old, I'm old, so you're not old.
Okay, we're both young.
Yeah. So Darwish, in preparation for this event, I was rereading your translation of In the Presence of Absence, which if you haven't read, it is the most amazing book, but also one of the things about it is its refusal to have the arc. Mm-hmm. And to get at things sideways, poetically, through metaphor, through images that are left puzzling. Mm-hmm. And we were speaking in my workshop earlier today just about, in fact, one of my students brought in the word puzzle, puzzling, and we were talking about the refusal to clarify. Mm-hmm. As part of the translation. And I feel some of that in your own novels too, the sort of sideways writing and using metaphors and very playful. Mm-hmm. Is this even a question? It's an observation, but I can see why you love Darwish, and maybe was he an important influence on you for your own writing?
Yeah, definitely. To me, the tension between the aesthetic and the political is, so many writers and poets all over the world who, because of their ideological position or because of the pressures on them to respond to certain political events, end up writing forgettable novels and forgettable poems. So what fascinates me about Darwish is that he has managed to keep this tension alive and actually end up being one of the most innovative and pioneering poets writing in Arabic without ever relinquishing the pressure and the mandate to be the voice of a people. But also in the process, rather than succumbing to the expectations of his readers, he would always actually challenge them and take them somewhere else. And if we look at his trajectory from, of course, starting out as a very young poet in Israel where his existence was denied because there were no Palestinians. So early on his poems are simple. Register I am an Arab was the most famous poem. But there's a very important moment. So Darwish becomes very famous because he's one of these resistance poets. He goes to Cairo in 1971, and in Cairo everyone asks him to recite that poem, Register I am an Arab. And he refuses to do so, which is so brilliant because he says, I wrote that in Israel where my existence is denied. Why would I read it here for you? And then we see the transformation from writing direct political poetry into turning Palestine into a metaphor, and so on and so forth. So that's always very important, the way to also not to spoon feed your audiences and make the reader part of the process of producing the meaning. And the issue of linearity and arc is something very important on so many levels, even politically, because nationalisms and empires are narratives at the end of the day, and this arc and closure is oftentimes too comforting in a way to foreclose any discussion. And we know on this continent what that means. We know why there is no closure or linearity in Toni Morrison, because all of these stories are still alive, and so that was never, for me, tenable to write a simple, straightforward story, but I increasingly started to realize that ethically and epistemologically it's very important to defy this linearity, but also to engage the reader in the potential of, it sounds like it's too cheesy, but to writing together really. And from teaching, I teach a course on modern Arabic novel. I've been teaching for 15 years, and it's fascinating how every year or two there is a new reading of the novel by a student, something that neither I nor the author had in mind, which speaks to something that Benjamin wrote that I really love about how works of art, I think he says something about how the works of art have their own life. And that's not, he says, it's not a metaphorical thing. They do have a life and have an afterlife.
The Nachleben. Okay, you said I was required to ask you one hard question. You ready?
Uh-oh, yes.
So, is there any moment in your work on Darwish where you have to think about your own positionality, your own cultural, political, social positionality, and are there ever challenges that you find representing his work?
I translated mostly his latter work, which is in a way less explicitly political in a way. It's political on a much deeper metaphorical meaning, so I haven't encountered that. Now that there is a poem that after the 1982 invasion and siege and occupation of Beirut by the Israelis, which was a catastrophic and killed and wounded 50,000 people, I was reminded of all of that with the genocide in Gaza, because although it's unprecedented in terms of scale, but a lot of the dynamics, back then there was no social media and there was no TikTok, but a lot of the dynamics and the practices were there. And Darwish wrote an epic poem after that, because he was in the city and he was under bombing for weeks, and then he had to leave, which he mentions briefly in this one. And in trying recently to translate that poem, there are these moments where I've stopped because there are certain expressions that he himself later abandoned. There was like, explicit condemnation of the United States and of other, which is not a problem because I think that's part of the history.
Yeah.
But not in the latter poetry, which some of his earlier readers dislike because it's very distant from the earlier simple, more typical resistance poetry. But he has what I admire about him is not just his poetry and prose, but even in the interviews, how thoughtful he is. So he says that my readers are like, it's like a train. There are some people who get off and new people come on, so it's okay. But for me, it's also the creative use of the Arabic language. I think this is what amazes me about poetry in general, in any language, is how you read a line of poetry and you see an image, and it's like magic. It's a new relationship, and so the ability to always innovate is just fascinating.
Were you able ever to meet him?
Yes.
Tell us.
That's one of my major faux pas, actually. He got the Lannan Prize in 2000, I think, which is a major prize that the Lannan Foundation gives. And I had already started translating some of his poems, and the event was going to be at some college, Swarthmore, or one of the liberal arts colleges somewhere. So I drove all the way from Cambridge there and attended the poetry reading, and he was introduced by Edward Said, and then afterwards he was surrounded by all these fans, the groupies, who were mostly attractive young women. And I came to him and kissed him right away on the cheeks, which is normal in our part of the world if you know someone. But I think he was just really shocked. Who is this person kissing me? And I told him I'm one of your translators. He was like, okay. But then I met him again in 2003 in Cairo. There was another poetry reading, and I was a more respectable person with dignity. Yeah.
I'm glad you got to meet him.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's interesting character.
Yeah. I mean, he only got to be a decade older than us. He never got to be that old.
That's true. No, I guess the other fascinating thing about him, and many people say that, is that he was so. I mean, it's always unfortunate, but a premature death, because actually he kept changing, and in the last 10 years of his life, he was even more prolific. And so he died at the height of his productivity, and he had so much more to give. So, this is the fear that so many writers have and poets, that you're depleted at a certain period and have no more to give. But he seemed to always have more and was constantly writing.
I know that others in the room have questions, so I'm going to hand over the microphone in 1 second. I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'm going to start inviting you to ask questions, which you can do loudly from the back, or if you want, you can come up and use this microphone. You translate others and you translate yourself. Are you a faithful translator of yourself?
We don't want to get into this whole. I think I am. There was one thing that we spoke about. That, in Arabic, there's the gap between the formal Arabic and the dialects is a bit, many would say, bigger than the gaps that we have in other places. But also, in all of these countries, like every other country, there are different regional dialects. And in my Arabic novels, I happen to be someone who writes the dialogue in the dialect. This is a big issue in the Arab world for a variety of reasons. But there are a lot of novelists who write the dialogue not in the dialect, which to me is very jarring and odd. So that's impossible to translate into English. Because how would I render that? You know, if I use Southern dialect, that would have completely different connotations. So that's a place where I cannot, you know, reproduce the echo, and that's where there is actually, although I hate harping on lost translation, but that's where something is lost. I mean, there are tricks sometimes or ways to use expressions or idioms, but that's impossible to reproduce. But I think the privilege of translating oneself is that no matter how one thinks about it, I'm more at liberty, of course, because I can change a few things. I mean, it happened when I was first translating the novel The Corpse Washer, and I was just kept looking at the Arabic and trying. Then I thought, you know, it's mine to do whatever I want to do. I am as much as possible faithful, but the problem is, and even though Tisam told me not to talk about this in public, but the problem is the fights with the editors, which always exist. But as I said, there is.
I fight with them too.
You fight with them too, but with them. And Marilyn Booth, who's an excellent translator, has written articles about this, the desire that North American editors have to kind of domesticate Arabic text.
Sometimes with the authors, you know, egging on.
Yes.
Even tragically, I think.
Yes. But the complicity of the author.
Yeah. And so the editors tend not to want the books to sound weird. But
Yes.
like writing is weird. all writing that is interesting is weird.
I agree.
And people forget that when they're editing translations and they think, oh, this is weird, it must be a mistake.
And this happened with Darwish because the first two chapters of In the Presence of Absence, even in Arabic, he's trying to, you know, engage with these philosophical ideas about existence and being, and even in Arabic they are a bit odd, and that was the fight with the editors. Like, well, there's this desire to clarify everything, and it ends up flattening it, right?
Right. Which is why over-edited translations are boring.
Or as the editor told me when translating a novel, he's like, this doesn't happen in an American novel. Or, and I have to say this, it was like, there's too much sex in the novel. So I was like, you know, I'm confused because you guys say we're a puritanical culture, and then I said, who decides how much is enough sex?
I think this is a great moment for us to take questions from the audience. Okay, Umair.
Because I just actually read your translation recently, and it's a very weird book, so I wasn't sure.
Which one?
The recent Darwish translation, that's in the presence of absence. I was confusing it with Memory of Forgetfulness, but that's.
Why is it weird?
Well, I mean, it's the most indirect Darwish that I've ever read. It's like it's very interesting because like the ideas will just kind of turn in, well, extremely unexpected ways, and then you're just like, where's the white horse coming in? But it just keeps going and going, like he doesn't lose his momentum. So I don't know, there's not much of a translation question there, but it's a very weird book, like really amazing. But I felt like the race that I'd read before, like State of Siege and, you know, like the Beirut stuff was like a little bit more like, you know, direct. And this was, yeah. A lot more to say about the race. I'll talk to you after. But my question was, so you lived in essentially two types of censorship regimes. There was the censorship of a dictatorship that produces a different kind of reaction from a writer and a translator. And then there's the sort of this diffuse censorship where no one takes you seriously, or like, you know, or yeah, I mean, you're like either commercially being sort of, you know, like you said, like if you have a good idea for a novel that really speaks to your experience, the editor is just like, well, like write like about being brutalized as an Iraqi or a Pakistani or an Afghani or whoever. But So I'm just wondering, what do you make of this type of censorship that you've probably experienced in America? Like kind of yeah.
No, that's an excellent question. And I just want to say in defense of Darwish that in the foreword, so Darwish was told that he might not live very long because of a heart condition.
Mm-hmm.
So he wrote this book thinking it is his last book.
It feels that
And
way.
he said that it was a celebration of the Arabic language, where he would write a page and come the next day. So there was this sense of, ironically, I mean, he's about to die, this could be his last book, but there was this sense of freedom, actually. I mean, something to be said about late style, right? Where he wasn't really concerned, perhaps, with readers' expectations or anything. And you see that in the Arabic, it's kind of a celebration of the potential of language.
I didn't know that, but it definitely seems like something from the beyond. Like when I read that, I was just like...
I mean, it's sneaky because he preempted any eulogies, because that's what people say, I mean, what can they write? He's already, and it's very brilliant use of a very old Arabic form of self-elegy. And even the book is about, it's like a tombstone, and it's the living and the dying, and also it's autobiographical, but not in the traditional sense, because it has a lot to do with how he discovered language, how his village was destroyed, and how he then visits the village when it's nothing, and Beirut and Paris. So it's basically, that's why I called it a poetography. Now, about the censorship, yes, I mean, when I speak to my friends and colleagues who don't live here, of course, people who live in the global south, they, not anymore perhaps, but they think there's this, ultimate openness and freedom, and we know that, here it's not as vulgar as it would be in another place, but you're right. But at the end of the day, I think that being at the margins, right, is much better than being at the center. And in a way, being a minority in so many senses. I mean, I grew up as a minority in Iraq, as being a Christian, from a Christian family in a Muslim majority country. Don't get it in the wrong way, but I think being on the margins makes you more susceptible to having critical perspective on things, and no regrets. I mean, and we all know, I hope, that it's, there's this ephemeral fame and focus, especially, to be honest with you, sadly in this country also, right after destroying a country, there's this intense interest in the culture of that place that fades after a year or two. And oftentimes this liberal guilt and rush to translate is, ends up not translating the most consequential. So I guess what matters is what will be read 5 or 10 or 15 years later. And to go back to the earlier question, again, I normally want to be read in every language. But I realized, to be honest with you, that these novels, because they all speak about Iraq and the region in the last 3 decades, also it's very rewarding that they are read in the Arab world and they mean a lot to the people there. So my odd situation is, I say, my constituency is mostly far away, not here. I'm like a congressman, right? Except I don't have donors.
Should work on that part.
No, but I keep railing against social media with all of its ills, but it's the great thing about social media, it allows one to communicate with their readers, right? So someone reads a novel and writes to you on Instagram right away, and you realize, okay, so I am in conversation with readers, and that's what matters.
Before social media, the sort of gatekeeping of the mainstream publishing industry was pretty absolute.
Yeah.
And now we have a landscape in which smaller presses can flourish and
Yes.
publish beautiful, Archipelago, nonprofit publisher in Brooklyn, publishing this beautiful book.
Definitely.
More questions? Okay, Kaya, and then.
Yeah, so you mentioned poetry just now, and also in the preface. I'm actually very fascinated by that concept because a lot of people, when, for example, I say I write poetry, they automatically think I just write about myself, whereas perhaps some other poets might write with a poetic persona. So I find it very interesting that you're making this distinct concept about the self, and I also wonder how your own poetry kind of relate to that concept as well for you.
Yeah, that's a tough question. I'm reminded of Neruda, when despite recent discoveries about some horrible acts that he committed, but there's this thing about poetry being the fusion or combination of solitude and solidarity. So I think that's the important thing about this spectrum. So on the one hand, there is an I that's speaking, and that's inescapable. But it's about where one situates oneself as a human, as a poet, as a writer, as a citizen, right? Not only in the relation to other bodies and other places, but as opposed to the relationship to the place and the history of place. And that's where, for me, Darwish, but other poets as well, or Benjamin, have been very important in how, both aesthetically but ethically also, understanding where one is and what one's speech or silence means in relationship to the world. So that's how I try to think of my poetry, and to, how should I say this? I mean, this is more important at this moment and in recent years, as we realize what we as humans have done to other sentient beings, to what surrounds us, and so on and so forth. And by the way, although I said that poetry is an ethical compass, but also, and that's an unpopular opinion, but poetry and literature has also played a very sinister role in colonialism, in settler colonialism, in erasing other people's cultures, and making then their destruction just a logical conclusion. We have so many examples of poets, and some of even, a few years ago, even Whitman, by the way, right? Whitman is celebrated as the all-embracing and all of it, but I discovered there's some really horrible poems celebrating the pioneers and the destruction of the other inferior races. And going back to the problem of...
He was a white guy after all.
You said it. No, and we have this. So I guess this all comes to the current moment. There's a core problem in the way we go about things, and there's a problem with this colonial modernity, right? So it's not to just condemn and denounce everyone, but to look at what. Going back to Benjamin, I'm obsessed with him, but how barbarism is at the heart of civilization, the idea of civilization, or this progress, and the rubble, the mountains of rubble, at whose expense all of that came. What else was it? Oh, I was going to say, since we're talking about translation also, the translation also has a sinister role, or had in the colonial and imperial period, where the denigration of other languages. There is this infamous minute on Indian education, maybe some of you know about it. What's his name? Macaulay, who was the British official at the time when the UK occupied India. There was the issue of whether the United Kingdom should keep financing the teaching or the printing of the local languages in India, Arabic and Urdu and Persian. And this comes up a lot in these post-colonial writings. And this Macaulay said, I don't know Arabic or Urdu or Persian, but I have asked the Orientalists and the people who know, and I can pretty much say that everything written in those languages is not worth one shelf of English literature. And it's horrendous and horrible. But that sentiment continues until today, actually. And that's why we speak of the problems of the dynamics and hierarchy of which languages are privileged and where is, literary greatness produced or expected. You see it in The Guardian, like the best 100 novels of the century. Like, they're all in English. It's like, or even when I started teaching at NYU, would be courses taught where it said, the novel, and forget about the Arabs and the Africans, not even from South America. Okay, so things have changed a little bit, thankfully. But even there would be courses on American poetry, and maybe there would be one token African American poet. There was never a Native American poet. So, sorry, I had to get aside to this about the shelf and what's worth and so on and so forth.
The title of the talk is The Politics of Translation.
Oh.
And you chose. I don't think anyone's shocked.
I just wanted to add about the poetography, because Darwish says, and I believe it, that he really was completely dedicated to poetry, and you even see it sometimes that there's a sense that this being considered the national poet is a burden, actually. You even see it in some of his poems. Were it up to him, he would have just wanted to be a poet, would not want to be a national. It's even in some of his poems where he says, I look for myself and I find the hordes of people. Mm-hmm. So there's a desire even to be forgotten. So that's why I thought of poetography. Because he cannot really even be, some people dream of having this privilege, being a representative of a people. But he wanted just to be an individual that has some autonomy aside from these complications. Sorry.
Please, in the front and then Daniel.
Is it okay if I say something and then ask the question? Like, it's not about.
Yes, it's America.
Okay, so first, I just wanted to say that I know even despite what you said, John is one of my favorite books, and you're one of my favorite writers, and I feel like I'm serious, and I feel like it's drawn from this immense well of empathy that is completely perceptible, and it's not everywhere that you read. And there's such sadness and also beauty in it, and sharpness, and it's funny at the same time, so sharply funny. It's I have a hard time just describing it. I have a hard time describing one thing, but I feel like I'm not doing it justice, because it's just incredible, and I feel like we're losing out on not having more of your own work. And I know this is a translation, and there's such beauty.
Wait, are you going to tell them to stop translating? Because I
Please don't. But the question's about translating. Okay. My question is actually about what are some of the things that you've learned maybe from Darwish or from other poets that you've worked with, or other writers that you've worked with, that you were surprised about, or that were made you even yourself look at the writing in a different way?
Well, first, thank you for what you said. It's really, I'm grateful and happy, and just wanted to say that this, it's a cliche, but I think humor and comedy has always been a tool of survival for people under dictatorship, under slavery, under horrible conditions, because otherwise you would go mad, and that was always a refuge. About what I've learned, I must say that, growing up in the 80s and growing up also in Iraq, there is this, frankly, overwhelming pressure from European modernity that makes so many of us at pains to emulate and to learn more about the global north. And that's good, but a lot of times it comes at the expense of the local tradition. right? Because that's frowned upon. What I learned from both Darwish and Sargon Bolos, even though Sargon Bolos, who is an Iraqi poet who came to the US in the 60s and stayed in San Francisco, but he's translated like 2,000 pages of poetry from English into Arabic. He was so engaged with Anglophone poetry and so knowledgeable, but at the same time, he deified, well, not deified, but had immense respect for quote-unquote classical Arabic poetry. The same thing with Darwish, and the same thing with Sadi Youssef, one of my other favorite poets, who's very well read and reads in French and English, and himself translated Ritsos, Kavafi, Whitman, but he always says that he goes back to, so what I've learned is to go back to pre-modern poetry, not just Arabic, but in other traditions, to have that base, because that gives you so much wealth to draw from. And it's always, you know, and even when reading old Scandinavian epic poetry, you realize, of course, you know, our species has changed so much, of course. But also there are the basics that haven't changed about death, desire, the tragedy of the human condition. So I've learned from them to be humble and modest and to realize, and I'm here quoting Sadi Youssef, it's like when I wanted to be poet and then I started looking at Arabic poetry, it's like there's 14 centuries. So you just have to be a little bit humble and modest and realize that you are a student and will always be a student, which is, I think, important for students in general, but students of literature and poetry, because at this point, maybe not in this room, but I get some students who are, I understand the eagerness and the desire, but there is the sense that they're already well formed. But to go back to Sadi Youssef, who is probably one of the most important poets in the Arab world in the last 60 years. In 2009, I was in Morocco, and he had published the 7th volume of his complete works. And there was a book signing, and there were these little young girls from a high school. I even wrote this in the obituary for him in the LA Review. And one of the girls told him, "Oh, my colleague is a poet." And she was embarrassed, and she told him, "I'm just a beginner." And he told her, "We are all beginners." And he meant that. And this is how can one really be innovative, and is to begin again as if they haven't written anything. So of course it's easier said than done, but I was really moved that this person who had written already 7 volumes and was in his late 60s, but he invited that girl and told her, "Look, poetry is, you know, we're all beginners." And so that, for me, that was a very powerful moment.
Well, we talked a bit about you translating your own work and the challenges that happened because of that. But do you think there were things, no matter how small, that worked better in the translations? Like were there any doors open, like you translated your own work?
It would be too narcissistic for me to say that. I think you have to ask someone else. But I will answer your question hopefully in a different way. This Ajam, the first novel, plays on, there's a lot of wordplay because of the way Arabic is written and because of the dots. And if the dots are changed, it changes the meaning. And supposedly it was a manuscript found in prison but written without dots. And then one of the security people has to basically cross the T's and dot the I's and try to figure out. And since there's a lot of wordplay, he's confused because it could mean different things. I co-translated with Rebecca Johnson at the time because I started translating it and then I had to go to Baghdad to film the documentary, so she offered to finish the translation. And when she was translating it, I told her, look, if there are places where there could be wordplay in English, that's not in the original Arabic, you go ahead and do that. Because some of the wordplay was impossible to translate. It would require 3 footnotes. And so she did that in a couple of places. So that's where, and I don't remember, but there are places in the novel, my novel, that I translated where I slightly changed the expression because it sounded better in English. And frankly, deleted a few phrases because it's a play on words that wouldn't work in English at all. So there is failure. There's this famous poet that I mentioned, Al-Jawahiri, who writes in the very classical language, and I've tried to translate his poems, and I just give up because it just the echo doesn't work in English. It would be too academic. So.
There's a question all the way in the back.
Hi, I'm Samir. Sorry, I came a little late, so sorry if my question is redundant at all. But I was wondering, when it comes to translating Arabic, obviously you have such a large body of work to choose off of, and you talked a little bit about like addressing demand, I guess, in a certain way. So I'm curious if there were ever instances where you were interested in translating something that like maybe didn't have as much like demand behind it, or people that were willing to publish it, and if, I guess both ways, like if there was something you were interested in translating and did that turn out the way that it did, or if there was something you were less interested in translating but there was an opportunity to translate it, and like how did those experiences kind of differ, I guess, in a certain way, or did it hold?
No, that's a great question. I mean, there was a point when there is this journal in London, Bani Pal, that is no longer operative. I helped them a lot. Sometimes I translated things that I liked and sent to them, but a lot of times I was kind of a guerrilla translator. They needed poems to be translated, and I did the translation, which was a good practice for me. And to be honest, sometimes some of the poems I didn't want to translate, but I did it. But I don't know if it's maturity or the protection of tenure or having won a few prizes, but in recent years, both in terms of writing and translation, I am basically translating for myself. So there's a lot of poems that I've translated that I haven't published. Because maybe I'm lazy or because it doesn't really matter that much. And same thing with writing. There are a lot of poems. So the challenge is for me to write a poem that I'm happy with. And okay, eventually I'll translate it, but it doesn't have to be translated right away, which I think is I've reached a good, peaceful, healthy situation whereby I'm not discounting at all the need to be published, and we all go through that. Sometimes I feel that, and I post something right away on Twitter and whatever. But oftentimes it's better to keep these things, to keep the text, whether writings or translations, give them some time and let them ferment in a good way. I'm always thinking of the relationship between winemaking and writing, especially poetry. Going back, it takes, I should have said, I learned from these people patience, right? Especially at this point, everything is about speed in this world, and poetry is one way of taking a break and exiting this circuit, and taking a moment to let things mature, which I have found to be much better. But I've suggested to publishing houses. I'm lucky because, for example, one of the most important Iraqi novelists, Antoon, who wrote 5 amazing novels in the 1670s, is not translated into English. We go back to the same problem. Badr Shakir Sayyab, one of the poets who revolutionized modern Arabic poetry, I've translated some of his poems, is not translated into English. And then you have some young poets have 3 or 4 collections. So there is an unevenness. I mean, if I had another lifetime, I would translate so much. But I have to also strike a balance. Because there are characters that are waiting for me from the novels who are like, what is going to happen to me? But I understand, I mean, let's be honest, early on, as a translator, there is no escaping the whole notion of career, right? But I guess I'm trying to say that as much as one can somehow protect one's own choices and taste, and it's all about also making these compromises with the powers and the networks, but without losing too much or giving in too much. That's why we need millionaires to support us without strings attached. But I'm 56 and the millionaire has not arrived. I guess that's
It's very late. If somebody has one more urgent question, you may ask it now. Otherwise, I would say let's begin to mill around, and you can come up and say hi if you want. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.